In this video, I'll be turning myself into Chainsaw Man using the heart of the Chainsaw Devil. And Photoshop. Mostly Photoshop. Let's get started. First things first, I went through and took a couple of pictures of myself. I opted to go with this one here because it seemed like the most high action pose. The other ones were cool, but this one I felt had the most potential. Now that we're in Photoshop, let's put me in and isolate me from the background. The first few steps were pretty simple. I used the select subject to cut me out and then used the layer mask to adjust the selection. Then I tweaked the color and lightness of my shirt and pants to make it more closely resemble what Denji wears in the anime. I used the hue and saturation layer to lighten my shirt to make it more white since the shirt I was wearing was technically a shade of blue, and I made my pants a lighter shade of gray. Now we get into the meat of it. This is the part where I was beaten and left for dead in a dumpster, but instead of dying, I merged with a couple of chainsaws that I downloaded from Envato Elements. The first ones to appear were the ones down my arms, but the angling was a little off, so I had to break both of my hands to get them to fit. In order to add the chainsaws to the middle of my arms, I had to make some changes. This was simply just getting rid of the engine part of the chainsaw and rounding off the blade by copying the end of the chain and placing it at the bottom. In order to add the chainsaws to the middle of my arms, I lined them up by lowering the opacity and working with this reference image, counted which finger it was supposed to go into, which made it very weird because you're transferring this from a hand-drawn style to a somewhat realistic photograph. And I don't know about you, but splitting my arms down the middle is not a Photoshop skill that I've practiced before, so it was very weird looking at it before it was done. To counter this point, I also added shadows to the chainsaw and the hands as if they were touching and the light was blocking certain parts of each of my arms. Also, my sleeves weren't rolled up all the way, so finding out where the chainsaw was supposed to end at my elbow was a little tricky for at least one of the arms. The next part was the make or break of the piece, the actual chainsaw head. Honestly, going into this, I didn't really have a clue how I was going to approach this. I figured I would have a photo on the side as a reference and do the best I could to match the angle from that to the photograph of me. I sketched that out and actually looked pretty good for what it was. If I had went forward with it, I think it would have turned out pretty good. But as I was searching for a reference image, I found a figurine of Chainsaw Man that happened to be at the same angle that my head was at in the picture. So I wound up overlaying that on my head and breaking down that into basic shapes to use later on. The dimensions were a little small, but I only needed it as a reference, so it wasn't that big of a deal. I went through selecting different parts of the head, separating them by color and spacing and even texture in some cases, and turning them into their own shape layers made of solid colors. This is really the first time I've tried something like this, especially with an image. I've learned a lot of it by watching other YouTubers do it, specifically Benny Productions' Realistified series, where he takes other people's drawings and turns them into realistic Photoshop things. And just passively watching that was very beneficial to the making of this process. I think if I had gone through and did it myself freehandly, it would not have been as good as this turned out being. With everything broken down into its own shapes, I went through adding shadows and highlights to each of the different parts of the head. For the texturing, I gathered a bunch of photos and 3D elements from Envato and used warp to put them into place and match the respective angles, and added shadows and highlights on the 3D elements where there weren't exactly any. This included the brushed metal on the front of my head, the engine on the back, and the pipes around my neck. And the chainsaw, but that one was a given. At this point in the process, once all the textures were in, I also wound up redoing the handles on the top of my head and the back of my neck because they were a little stumpy and I wanted to make them look like they were wrapping around my head from one side to the other. So using the pen tool, I went through and redid that. Now, the teeth were menacing enough as it is, but it was missing that extra scare factor. So I went in with the pen tool and created a shape of a tongue that closely matched the one in the anime. And I used the same method as before to shade and texture it, and voila, I am Chainsaw Man. Kind of. There was a few finishing touches that I had to do. I had to give myself a tie using the liquefy and warp tool to make it look like it was blowing in the wind, and I also opted to increase the shadows and contrast around the creases in my clothing to make it a bit more stylistic. So, that's how I became Chainsaw Man. But there's one small issue. My feet didn't make the picture, so what do you say we spice some things up with a background? I'll meet back up with you once we're all done. And there it is, turning myself into Chainsaw Man, bursting out of the Snake Devil. I really like how the transformation of this piece turned out. Like I said, the head was the make or break of this. I'm really glad that I used the reference because I think it really sold it. If I had gone in from scratch, I think it would have felt off. But overall, the chainsaws, the clothing, the blood, and the shading all turned out really nice and really makes it look like Chainsaw Man. And I don't know really how to explain it, but the way I chose to increase the shadows and everything makes it match the style or the vibe of the show itself. Maybe the parts where Chainsaw Man is 3D in the 2D environments, I don't know. Let me know if you see that, because that's just the vibe I'm getting from it looking at it. Speaking of the environment, I think it could have been a little better had I spent more time with it, maybe come up with a couple thumbnail sketches and a few extra ideas. Because there's really just 2 buildings, and if I'm bursting out of a devil that put up a good fight, they should not be in pristine condition. Also, the snake devil itself looks kind of plain. Maybe I should have added the head or something, but it is really just a textured tube. But like I said, this was one of my first times working and creating my own shapes and texturing them myself, rather than going through and adding and taking a image from somewhere else. I also went back recently and changed the color of the snake devil to match the one in the anime, that being a grayish white. And I gotta say, I think I prefer mine better. The white just doesn't match with the rest of the colors in the piece. At least the green in mine complements all the blood with the red and green contrast. So I think unintentionally taking a creative liberty really helped it out, and actually made it look better than if I was to go based off the anime designs. Overall though, I gotta say, it turned out a lot better than I expected, and I don't think the background takes away too much from the piece. So, yay! Anyway, that's all I got for you. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and feel free to show your support by liking this video. And if you want to see me turn myself into other fictional characters, I did a video a while back where I turned myself into Ben 10. Link should be either here or here. My camera's flipped, so I don't know which way it's going to be. But that's all I got for you today. Take care, everybody. I'll see you around.